thank you first of all very much for my welcome here. It's incredibly exciting to be in a place which I've spent some time reading about and researching and imagining. It's incredibly exciting to actually arrive here and think about the ways that I imagined Asansol and the real Asansol, which from my understanding might coincide. I think it was very, very beautiful to hear the songs just now, because as a person living in Scotland, I might not understand any Bengali, but I do understand those tunes. The tune's ability of that music is exactly a reflection of folk songs that were sung in Scotland, and indeed sung by very many of the people, the Scots, who left India, left Scotland 150, 180 years ago to come here and build places like Asansol. One of the curious things that's come up in conversation over the last few days while I've been here is nostalgia. There's a sense of nostalgia, partly as we walk around an area like this and see the remains of a culture that might appear to have disappeared. But secondly, the idea that this part of Asansol, the colonial part of Asansol, was built by and for people who had a nostalgia for a part of the world that was completely and utterly different to this. And this part of the city is, in a sense, the construction of nostalgia for a different world. What I'm going to do in this talk is talk about three particular ideas to you. So I'm going to talk first about the Secret Lives of Buildings, which I wrote in 2009, and thinking about the connection between stories and films. Secondly, I'm going to move on to the unfinished biography and share with you some of the research that I've been doing, particularly about George Turnbull, the first railway engineer, one of the major railway engineers here in the Great Eastern Railway in India. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about a very different project. I'm calling it a concrete monstrosity here, which is thinking about how do we deal with difficult heritage. Some heritage is easy. Perhaps the Taj Mahal is easy. Perhaps it's really easy if you ran the Taj Mahal. Perhaps there are some places where it's very clear what needs to happen. And then there are other places, for example, when we're dealing with industrial heritage or modern heritage or tangible heritage, which are much, much more complex and much, much more difficult. And what I want to do is share with you a project I've been working on with, in particular, a difficult and controversial heritage. But first of all, I'm going to talk a little about the Secret Lives of Buildings. And what I want to do, in particular, is I'm going to start with a history of art lesson, and then I'm going to move on to thinking about a particular relationship between stories and buildings. So I'm going to start my history of art lesson with an image of where I'm from. So this is Edinburgh, viewed from Carlton Hill. So this is the city in which I live, and what you can see here are a number of different key buildings. So this is Edinburgh Castle, this is the fort, this is Pantacot. Here are the 18th century monuments. The hill covered the monument to the philosophers of the city, built in the 19th century. And in the middle is the new town, the kind of commercial part of the city. So three different sections of the city. This is a city that was largely built in the late 18th century and the early 19th century. So most of what you see dates from that time. And here is a painting which is more or less simultaneous with the construction of Edinburgh. This painting is called The Architect's Dream, and it was painted by an American painter, Thomas Cole, in 1838. And the reason I'm showing you this painting is because when I was young and a student, like many of you, when I wanted to be an architect, this is what I thought my life was going to be like. I imagined I would be sitting on top of the ground column, looking at all the amazing buildings that are designed, monuments of architecture with great temples, civic buildings, and cathedrals, and so on. And this is called the architect's dream, this painting, because when we talk about dreams, we mean two things. On the one hand, a dream is a thing that we want to happen. A dream is a thing that we hope will come to pass. But the other thing about dreams is we all know they're not true, because the world does not look like that. The world is a mess. Bits are falling off it. They're leaking. The roof is falling in. Nobody has fixed the door. Buildings fall down all the time. And the architect's dream is a dream because the world does not look the way that architects would like it to be. It looks like something else. Now, Thomas Cole was a painter who was fascinated by architecture. And I want to show you some other paintings that he did. So this one is called, I'm going to show you a diptych, which means a painting, a double painting. Or two paintings that were created to be next to each other. But this one is called The Past. And what it shows is an imaginary castle with knights going up and down in front of it, jousting, beautiful scene. That's called The Past. And this painting is called, guess what? The Present. Because, as we all know, the present is the ruin of the past. Talk to your grandparents, they will never tell you that the world has got better. Nobody believes that the world is getting better. Everyone believes that the world is falling to pieces all the time. And everywhere we walk around us, we encounter the ruins of the past, the shattered hopes that people have, the things that were projected that never quite happened. What we see here is the lonely shepherd standing there, as you might find. Yesterday we went up to Antwerp Garden. Here is the vision we saw. This wonderful vision in the sense of contemplating the ruins of the past and the present. But this doesn't just happen. This doesn't just happen like that, instantly. This is a process. And there's a third set of paintings that Thomas Cole undertook, a cycle of paintings called the Course of Empire. And these paintings were painted in 1838 in what was not quite yet the United States. Okay, it certainly wasn't the American Empire that it's trying to be today. It was a wild country, an empty country, people imagined. And painting in this environment, Thomas Cole imagined in the landscape of the United States, the Hudson Valley, where he lived and worked. He imagined the rise of great empire. He painted the cycle of history in a series of 5 paintings that show different times of the day. So here is dawn. It's the dawn of civilization. You can see the red clouds. But it's not just the dawn of the day, it's the dawn of civilization. Here's the huntsman running through the forest, chasing an antelope, the tribesmen living at one with nature before, in a sense, civilization arrived. And then we get to kind of mid-morning, so this is coffee time, you might say. And here you can see a very, very different landscape. The forest has begun to get cleared, there is grass, there is pasture, and it's peaceful. And instead of a tribesman with an arrow chasing a deer through the forest, we can see an old gentleman sitting thinking. And what we can also see in this image is something which will be very, very familiar to you in India, but very unfamiliar to us in Britain. It's the rise of small shrines in the countryside. People are beginning to religion of some sort, and a small building with a sacrifice going on. Get to noon, and we're in a great city, the capital of London. And here we are lying and sitting with all the goods, all the treasures of the empire brought into the city. And it might seem in these paintings as if we are in completely different worlds. But look carefully at the details of these paintings. items. And you might notice one thing, I want to show it to you. This. This is the same place. It's not a different place, it's the same place. And the thing that distinguishes it is not place or time. Gaps of thousands of years, gaps of certain centuries. This is the same place. And if we're even cleverer at looking, we might notice that here there are people running towards a dark spot over the river, which becomes this early temple and sacrifice, which becomes this great round temple here. Move forward. Move forward a step. It's 1945 in Germany. It's America today, whatever it might be. It's the collapse of a great empire. The barbarians at the gates. The city is burning. The bridge has collapsed. And civilization is coming to an end. And what are we left with? But the ruins of the civilization as the sun sets and the moon rises. And we might imagine that once the civilization is ruined, that we are now in a situation where we have returned to the beginning. But of course we haven't returned to the beginning, because this is not nature. This is a landscape that's full of ruins. It's a landscape as yesterday as we were walking up Patchwork Hill. You could see things. You could see that a stone had been cut by somebody. Even if it was just one stone under a bush, you could tell that human beings had been there and lived there before. Once upon a time, there were humans there. So even if civilization is a circle, it's not just a circle. It's actually a spiral. Actually return to the beginning. Now, hold on from that for a second. This might seem like a depressing story, so when I speak to architecture students about this, they all get very depressed and they get angry with me because they say, we want to be that person in the architects. We want to build these beautiful buildings and everyone to love them and to be on the cover of the magazines and sparkle in the sunshine and all this kind of thing. And you're telling us we'll end up in ruins. Why should we bother? What a terrible thing. What is beautiful about a ruin? What is beautiful about a building when it's falling to pieces? What is beautiful about things from the past? And at that stage, I try to give them a model to think about something which is beautiful. And that model is this. Hands up if you have never heard of this story. I was wondering whether to do this with any story. And what I want to do is show you a series of images of this story. Here's an image, one telling this story. And here, what is Little Red Riding Hood? She's quite a clever girl, she's quite resourceful, she's going around to the forest, she's busy, that kind of thing. Okay, you can understand why she would have a conversation with people. You can understand why she would say that's very right. Okay. Let's look at this one. There's no, how can you be surprised that somebody like this would get lost? Of course you get lost. You've got no idea what's happening. You're lost in a dream. It's the same story, but told in a different way. Here she is, dark, deep in the forest. Okay, this is scary story. Here. Okay, does that work for everybody? Okay. And here she is enjoying being in the forest a little bit too much. You can tell that when she met the wolf, they're going to have a great time. And perhaps she'll run away with a wolf. But maybe it'll all go wrong, and she'll have to take her revenge. Okay. This is the same story. These are all different tellings of the same story. In the same way that there might be hundreds of different tellings of any story that we can think of. What I'd like you to think about is, how do we know this story? If I ask this in Europe, then everyone would say to me, the reason I know this story is because my parents told it to me when I was a small child. And then you ask them, you ask the parents, and you say, how did you know this story? Well, my parents told it to me when I was a small child. And so on, and so on, and so on. And then I might ask, do you know the original story? They go, oh yes, this was in the collection of fairy tales made by the Brothers Grimm in 1825 or whatever. Oh yes, but that, they were just writing down what they were told by an old woman who lived in the forest. Was she the original story? No. She'd been told it by her mother. She'd been told it by her mother. She'd been told it by her mother, who was a refugee from France, who come with these fairy tales written by Perrault, and he'd been told it by his nurse, and she'd been told it by somebody else. And so this story, like all really good stories, first of all has no meaning. People have always been telling this story in some way or another. And secondly, therefore, it also has no author. This is not Shakespeare. This is not Jane Austen. This is a story that exists on its own. Now, how does it relate back to architecture? Well, I want you to imagine me depressing those architecture students, telling them that whatever they do, it's all going to fall into ruin. Now, what happens with buildings if you're in one, certainly, is that about 50 years after a building is finished, all the people who were associated with the construction of that building are gone. Of course they are. The architect will be dead, the client will be dead, quite often the technology that built the building will be dead, and quite often the brief will be dead. The reason that the building was built and no one to be there. And we might say that's a sad and terrible thing, but actually it's fascinating and exciting. Because about 50 years after a building is finished, it's free. It no longer has to answer for the original reasons for its existence. At that moment, it can decide what it wants to do. Suddenly, the building is in control. And buildings start doing the most unexpected things. They start performing the most unexpected purposes that their makers could never imagine. So in the secret lives of buildings, what I wanted to do was to explore and tell stories about the unexpected things that buildings do after the original reasons for their existence. I'm just going to show you a couple of images of some of these particular stories. So this is an image, and it's in Italian, at the top of Veduta del Castello dell'Acropolis della parte di Tramontana, which means it's a view of the castle of the Acropolis in the country of Tramontane. Now, Tramontane is what we now call Greece. The Acropolis is the central monument in Athens, the capital city of Greece. And what we can see, it looks quite similar today. But this building you can see here is a mosque. You can see the minaret here. And what we can see are that this mosque is being bombed. So this is in 1679. And the mosque is being bombed by the army of Venice. And the building is being turned into ruin. This building was never built to be a mosque. In fact, by the time this image was made, this building was already 1,200 years old, and it was originally rebuilt as a temple to the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom in ancient Greece, Sarasvati in ancient Greece. And it was for a temple for 1,000 years, then it was a church for 1,000 years, and then it was a mosque. Then they blew it up. Now where is it? In London, in pieces. The sculptures that come at this temple were then bought by Elgin, the grandfather of the Elgin who was the So people don't just look after it, it's actually they blow them up. They try to destroy them.
that's part of the story of building. When we see a building that has been damaged or changed, we must remember that is as much a part of the story of that building as the original intention. Here's a slightly different one. I understand that there is a Loretto convent in Asansol. Yeah. Did anybody go to school at the Loretto convent? Hey, pupils here. So this house here, if you go to the town of Loretto in Italy, maybe you know this if you're going to the school, if you go to the town of Loretto in Italy, you will find a great church. And in the middle of that great church is a little house where the altar should be. And that little house is worshipped by people. People make a pilgrimage to the house. And they crawl around it on their knees, and they kiss the stones, and make sacrifices to it, and all that sort of thing. And the reason they do that is because of what we can see in this image. That little house, which is now in the town of Loretto, in Italy, was carried from Israel, from Nazareth, to Loretto in the 13th century. But originally, it was the house in which the Virgin Mary and Jesus lived. So it's the house where Jesus spent his childhood. And in the Middle Ages, when there was war, it was lifted and carried from one side of the Mediterranean, one side of the European world, to the other, and it was carried by Asians. So sometimes the transformations can take place to what become miraculous, as much as they may be discussed. Issue. I don't know how many of you remember 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And what has happened to the Berlin Wall? Well, actually, it's become sacred relics. Here we can see an image in. But I hold it far away. So here we can see an image of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and this little boy chipped pieces of the wall, and he is selling them so that you can buy a piece of the Berlin Wall, and you can take it home with you and say, I got a piece of the Berlin Wall. I helped bring down communism in 1989. It's a modern relic. And this building, which when I was a child living in Europe, I was told never ever go to the other side of that world. If you're from the West, if you're from Western Europe, never go over that wall because you will never come back. If you go into Russia, if you go into Eastern Europe, you will never ever be able to come back. And then it became a series of sacred relics. This painting is called Venice Goes to Macau. I don't know if any of you have been to Macau in China, where they built a whole replica of Venice as a casino in the land to which Marco Polo once went, going from Venice to meet Kubla Khan. But now you can go and see a plastic version of Venice in China. And heritage, however old it might be, can remain controversial. This is perhaps the oldest building in the world, or so we're told, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, where Adam, when first created by man, first put his foot here on Mount Zion. This is where Muhammad ascended to heaven to speak to the prophets in Jerusalem. And every day, if you read the news, you will read about violence in this city, in Jerusalem, because they are battling over what to do. Who does this temple belong to? Does it belong to the Muslims? Does it belong to the Jews? Does it belong to the Christians? Heritage can be something which is not just about the past, but also the time about the present. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about George Chandler and the unfinished biography. But before I do that, I would just like to introduce how I became involved in this project, which Assistant Professor Sansu Banerjee says must remain a secret forever. But he got in touch with me about a year ago, just a little bit over a year ago, talking about the project that was going on here in Asansol. And there were things that sounded very interesting about it, about industrial heritage and so on. But the one thing that caught my eye was the mention of Dundee cake. I don't know how many of you have eaten Dundee cake. Yeah. And he was describing this special recipe for the bakery in the town here where people eat Dundee cake. And why in West Bengal are they eating Dundee cake? And it turns out, of course, that it's not just the buildings of Asansol that contain within them the heritage of people coming from Scotland, from Dundee, as we shall see, a very long time ago, but also actually the heritage of recipes, of habits of mind, of people, and what they do, and what they're called, and what they believe. Now, there's an irony when one's doing studies, as we shall see, about the colonial period in a place like India. What I'm going to talk about in terms of George Turnbull's memoirs is one of those particular ironies, because this is a book which I can access in the National Library of Scotland, which is about building India, but actually nobody in India can access this book. And this is one of the great ironies of the colonial situation. Okay, that things were built in this country was created or reinvented by people who sent everything back to Britain. And that very often means we've had lots and lots of conversations in the last couple of days that the records of things here aren't here. They're in another country. They belong to another country. And that's a very, very strange, curious situation that we're going to come back to in. But what Santanu asked me to do was to kind of read and transcribe the memoirs of George Turnbull, which he knew were in the National Library of Scotland. So I had the real pleasure, before coming out here, of reading these memoirs. And as you can see, they brought out a very old book. I think I was the first person who read the book since it had been written. It's not great literature, I will say that, but it is very interesting literature. And it was brought out on a white cushion, and given the white gloves and all this kind of thing to touch the book. Very precious archival material. And what I'm going to do is take you through quickly the story of the creation of the railways in this part of the country, with mentions of Asansol, in those memoirs, and to think a little bit about some of the things that he was saying. But I wanted to start off by telling you about George Turnbull and where he came from, because he's one of those classic people who probably all of you know more about than people know about in Britain. There's probably enormous ignorance about this person in Britain. But he was a person that came from very humble beginnings. This is the place where he came from. It's a village called Huntingtower outside Paris in Scotland. And these images show things which would not have existed in Turnbull's time. So, for example, this railway wouldn't have existed because the railway wasn't invented when he was a boy here. This chapel did exist, and his parents were a member of the chapel. So he came from a farm. His father ran a mill in the farm and looked after a particular bleach fabric. So there was a bleach field, is what they called it, so he used to white the fabric. George Turnbull went to Edinburgh University, where I work now, and dropped out of university because he wanted to be an engineer. At that time, an engineer wasn't a proper subject to study in university. You studied Latin, and philosophy, and history, and religion, but engineering, a practical subject, was of no interest to the university. Sometimes it feels the same in universities today. And here are some of the projects which Turnbull worked on as an engineer, an apprentice engineer. So a lot of different projects. But the main one that he worked on was this here. This is the construction of the docks in Cardiff, in Wales. And I think this is a particularly relevant project for thinking about Turnbull, and particularly the East Indian Railway, for three reasons. One of them is obviously the railway itself, but the connection between the railway and other forms of transport. So the idea that the railway was taking things in one direction. What was this for? It was for transporting things from the centre of India to the coast of India, to the ports of Calcutta. Just in the same way that at Cardiff, the entire railway system, the dock system, was designed to transport one particular commodity from the interior of Wales, the first colony of the British Empire, to the sea. And what was that one thing? It was exactly the same thing in Cardiff, in Wales as it was here coal. Cardiff is a city that's built entirely on coal, and the fortunes on coal. The other thing I wanted to do was just highlighted in red the projects that involved the railways. So you can see for most of his time, before he comes out to India, in 1850, he's actually working on projects to do with canals and bridges and things like that. So the railway itself was a very new technology in Britain at this time, and I'll return to the consequences of that in a little while. Now, one of the questions that was being asked in the 1840s in particular about that new technology was the possibility of a railway in India. And the interesting thing is that everybody thought it was a completely stupid idea. I love this image because it makes it look like a stupid idea as well. Elephants and things that are going along on the train, but nobody thought it would be a good idea, and there was a particular reason, which was first of all that the embankments would be washed away by the floods, and secondly that the railway sleepers would be eaten by insects. And they thought at this early stage of railway technology that it would be impossible, therefore, to build railways in India. Turnbull later observes in a memoir that actually they need never have worried about the whiteouts and termites because the movement of the sleepers, because of the trains going over them, would actually frighten the termites away, which is one theory about why they were not probable. But we can also see here the reason, and this is kind of why he was interested in coming to India, is Mr. and Mrs. Tucker were family cousins. Mr. Tucker, one of his cousins, was a director of the East India Company and was particularly interested in pursuing the railway idea. Now, why build a railway in India? First of all, is it possible or not? Secondly, why do it? Well, the reason is particularly to do with this area, one with which I'm sure you're well acquainted, which is transportation of coal, as I was saying. Before the railway, the problem here was transporting coal from this part of the country down to Calcutta, down the river. But the problem is, of course, the river is only there for a few months of the year, and that means there are whole months where it is impossible to move it. And that's one commercial enterprise, but it's worth remembering, and this is one of the real curiosities of this time, the 1840s and 50s, is that India itself was a commercial enterprise, or at least the government of India was a commercial enterprise, the East India Company. In 10 years' time, Amazon and Facebook will have armies. And in that sense, it would be rather like the East India Company. The East India Company wasn't Britain, the East India Company was a private company. But what was interesting here, we can see discussions about what it was for. Because transporting all that coal down the river wasn't about making money in India, for India. It was about making money in London. And the way that money was raised was by investors in London. But nobody would invest, nobody believers would work, unless the East India Company itself actually also invested in the railway. So there's some really interesting information in a memoir about the kind of the shareholding, the kind of financial politics in London of the construction of the railway. But there were lots of people who just didn't do it. And here we've got a couple of examples of officers of the East India Company in Calcutta who just didn't believe. So Sims left Calcutta by the steamer on 7th of December 1850, telling me before he went away that he did not think the government of India, or rather I should say the East India Company, really intended to make any railway in India at all. I told him whether they liked railways or not, they were sure to be made to some extent, as we got the money subscribed and paid for in London. And then Charles Hugh Lushington, the officer in the East India Company, was appointed to deal with property deals. Says that actually he thinks that this was completely impossible and a waste of money. And he put a whole deal of obstacles in the way. So one of the chief obvious problems of trying to build a railway is what land do you build it on? Who does the land belong to? And how do you buy the land and how do you get it through there? And Lushington made this extremely difficult for Turnbull. He said, unless you own the land, you can't walk on it to measure it. And therefore, you can't build a railway. But the problem was, then how did you know where the railway was going to go if you couldn't go on the land to measure it? And so Turnbull explains the story about starting to build a tower. He's erected a bamboo tower 80 foot high at Saranpur, setting out the line of the railway. But the problem, obviously, in this part of the world that you would never encounter in Britain is palm trees. In particular, in that region, we don't get palm trees, we just have open land with grass. So you couldn't see where the land was. And so eventually you lose the patience. And he just goes in there and chops down all the trees in a straight line, and if people's houses are there, he demolishes them or moves them, and he's censored by the company for doing so. Then there's the issue of where should this railway line go? So the original model for it was that it should follow the Grand Trunk Road, but he thinks there are economic reasons for it to follow another route. And what that means is that to find a new route for the railway, they need to go through land where there are no roads. There is no existing form of transportation. And so actually it becomes quite an adventure. And they set out on regular trips up to this region. And I just want to show you a couple of sketches of those trips. And here he is talking about the places that he's gone. So Woodwood, Kairaksa, Mangalpur, Colliery, Raniganj, Colliery, and Asansol. You'll see he changes the spelling of Asansol all the time. I particularly liked this one, a description of going with some friends on one of these colleagues, one of these things, and interestingly, with Major Baker, his colleague, his wife, she was fond of botanical pursuits. She had a fancy for birds, and she had several cages with favourite canaries at camp, which was suspended on the tent ropes when we stopped. The journey from Asansol in Raniganj was mostly through a wild, jungly country with mere tracks for roads, occasionally with fine scenery. But we met with no adventures, except Mrs. Baker's goat being carried off by a tiger, and now and then having to go without our dinners because the carters got lost in the jungle. So nowadays we imagine it's the hub of transportation, but at that time you had to bring your own goat if you wanted anything to eat, and that might get eaten by a tiger. He goes further up the line, so this is him visiting Varanasi, and I think one of the curious thing about getting to Varanasi is he said how much it reminds him of Edinburgh, where he studied as a student. So here's one of Princeton's pictures of Goliath in the middle of Benares, and here's an image of the streets of Edinburgh at the same time. So it's a very similar city in his mind. But occasionally there are kind of really extraordinary cultural discoveries. So this is at Sultanganj, where they find an enormous pile of bricks. An enormous pile of bricks which is being used as a Muslim burying ground. They decide that what they want these bricks for, they're very useful for the railway, they want to use the bricks in order to put the ballast for the railway. So what they do is they have endless negotiations with the local Muslim community to buy the amount of bricks. And they say, give us the amount of bricks that the local Muslim community could use for their burial. And so in one sense, there we have a piece of cultural appropriation. But it actually masks another really interesting piece of cultural appropriation, because why in Bihar and southern Bihar would you have enormous amounts of bricks? Because it was originally a Buddhist stupa. And it got converted to a Muslim burying ground. And once they excavated the Buddhist stupa, what did they find at the bottom of it? Well, this extraordinary bronze statue of the Buddha, the Pataliputra period. Where is it now? Yes, Britain. It was taken back to the museum in Birmingham, where, very curiously nowadays, it's used for Buddhist prayers. So there are all sorts of pictures of Tibetan monks worshipping this in the museum in Birmingham. This railway is also part of an enormous
think this detail is a very interesting one. So we were talking about the problem of railway sleepers, and the idea that the problem with a railway sleeper is that the white ants would eat the railway sleepers, but they have to find the right timber to deal with this. So they first get foul with sleepers from Nepal, but they can't get enough. And so guess what happens in the end? They end up getting them from Scotland. One of the most curious things about this part of the railway is the timbers used for building it came all the way from Scotland. Then, in the meantime, they also actually come from Russia, and they're being taken to London for creosoting for treatment, and so on, brought all the way out here. So the railway was part of a globalisation today. It was very much part of that. The other interesting product that was exported through the railways in this period was opium, because the East India Company, of course, was the greatest drug dealer in history. The opium was harvested around Patna, transported down to Calcutta, taken to China, where it was used. The attempt was by the East India Company effectively to bring down the Chinese Empire through drug use. When that didn't work, they just had to sack it for Summer Palace. And there's a very interesting account of Turnbull's wife being given gifts of imperial silk from the Summer Palace in Peking as gifts by returning soldiers who were coming back to Britain through Calcutta. So, of course, this railway was political, because economics is always political. Key reason for its existence was the transportation of troops. So in particular, during the mutiny, during the first uprising, Turnbull is urged to finish this railway as quickly as possible. Doesn't matter how many people you throw at that railway, just get it finished, because we need to be able to get troops up from Calcutta into the centre of the country, to the centre of where the mutiny is taking place. The mutineers know this too, so they're delivering the railway. So the Soane Bridge further up is regularly attacked during an uprising. And that wants to underline a curious thing about this story, which is the relationship between himself, George Turnbull, this Scot, and what he calls the natives. What is that relationship? These images aren't actually the construction of the Eastern Railway, most of them from the railway to Nagpur, but they're kind of interesting images, because I'd like you to think through the kind of relationships between these people. Okay, there are 1, 2, 3 British engineers, and then Indian workers and things. Now, one of the things that is notably absent this diary from this memoir is any sense of social contact with the native. There is nothing. Not a single social occasion is described. While he describes a lot of what the British engineers he mentions at the beginning, when he arrives in Calcutta, that there are 5 native draftsmen, and their names are mentioned and then they disappear. So here are the sum total of all the references to them. So he describes going to the Mongol colliery, where he talks about women working on a gin and machine for raising coals. They all seem well fed and fat as they're in, and they have brass bangles on their legs or ankles, bracelets, nose rings, and very slight clothing. So there's something a bit strange about this description. What are these women? They're workers, they're building coal. He's noticing that they're kind of fat and happy and quite attractive, and they've got hardly any clothes on. Then he describes, in a sense, the human suffering that went into building the enormous number of people who actually died in the construction of the railway, particularly from cholera. Sequencing. This one is perhaps an interesting statement. He describes setting a camp where they set up camp in the night, they pitch their tents, next to the railway track, they wake up in the morning to find there are dead bodies lying in the woods all around workers who just dropped dead, where there's nobody left to bury them. So here we can see a list from the diary of different places and the number of people who were working on any part of a day. So I can't read that now, but it's 11,497 people here, and so on. Huge numbers of people working in various railway districts. And here's the number of engineers. Now, we always have a kind of joke about British Empire in Britain, which is that now it's so bureaucratic that the same number of people, the same number of British people anyway, used to run the entire British Empire that now run the City Council of London. So the local government of London now takes more people than it took to run the entire world 100 years ago. And that means there's always this curious relationship between British people and what Turnbull calls native people. Who was this railway for? What was this memoir for? And what were the conditions of power? Given that there were 40 million of these people, perhaps 2,000 of these people, how did it last for so long? It's a very strange thought that such control could be exercised. We finally get to the opening of the railway, and I think some of those conversations, this is an image from the London Illustrated News, and it's worth when one's thinking in terms of literature, is always thinking about images as well, and what images mean, because what does this show us? It shows a train going past, and the natives are watching it, and they're hailing it, and there are stories of people kind of worshipping the trains, as we can imagine, when they arrive. There's a great launch for the opening of the railway from the line up to Raniganj, an enormous event, 631 invitations, a public breakfast, a boardwalk, and a tent, and so on. There's a whole number of different sources which we saw last night finding out about this, and the grand ball in the railway company, given by the railway company in Calcutta. Here's again the image in the Illustrated London of that. And then later on, by the time that the line is extended up to Benares, there's a big festival there, and I've just been there, and there was a little bit of detective work, and so they describe having a dinner in a theatre, and this is the last time that George Turnbull is in India working on this job. He has to make a speech, and he says, I'm very glad, I was happy that I did not break down my speech. Very unusual for a Victorian gentleman to talk about bursting into tears in a speech in a public situation. And I was trying to find out where this was, and it turns out it's in the cantonment in Varanasi, this building, which is very similar actually, or a very small version of the Durand Institute around the corner. Though classically it's also been subdivided into houses, and one part of it is beautifully looked after, and the rest is falling down, so one of those kind of stories. But I was interested to note, here was this theatre where the grand opening took place, and what was next door? The Freemasons Institute. Because one of the interesting things was that Turnbull, presumably like most railway engineers at the time, I think that the boards on the wall in here would attest to that, were Freemasons as well. This is the preface at the beginning of the memoir. I'm going to read it to you because I realise it's a bit difficult to see here. And in this, he's telling us why he's writing this memoir. I set about a short memoir of my son, chiefly at the request of my dear wife, who is desirous of having a true and authentic record of my career, however short the story may be. One reason for the request being that it would be a satisfaction to her and our children, after I'm gone, to have a trustworthy narrative, even if it were only one of the dates and facts, because think it's quite ironic to say, well, I didn't have a very adventurous life. All I did, was build an old railway in the east of India, and, chase on the tiger and ate the goat, or whatever it might be. And he led an extremely adventurous life as somebody of the 19th century. But it was a life of which his wife and his children knew almost nothing. And when we ask ourselves, who is this written for? Of course, this isn't written for you. One of the ironies of this memoir is it was written for a very specific audience of his family and friends back in Britain, ensconced in their particular attitudes at the height of the British Raj, and so on, with a very, very particular image of Britain, or of an India, that they might never have seen. So what then? Well, here is, in a sense, the end result. And I don't want to conclude this part of the talk with a couple of questions, and I'm going to round up with one last final story for you. And those questions are, whose story is this? Because it might have been written by John Turnbull for his family and the British audience at the end of the 19th century, but whose story is it now? Yes, exactly, because you're here living with the consequences of these things in this place. How was it told? How did he tell it? And how can you tell it? Because if we return to the idea that I was talking about with Little Red Riding Hood, actually a story retold is a living story. It's not something buried in an archive and preserved for all time, but is something which comes to life once more. So I'm going to quickly finish up by talking to you about a project which might seem very, very different to this. And one of the things we were discussing yesterday as we were walking around, okay, so there we are looking at, for example, the temple at Panchakotta, it could be anything, and you're going, well, what do I do now? And I want to show a project I've been involved in which tries to answer that question. Whether correctly or incorrectly is up to you to decide. It's not unproblematic. And I want to show you and think about particularly whether this model would be interesting and appropriate in India as opposed to Britain, as a very different context that one might find oneself. So I'm going to tell this as a story. As you might have guessed, I like the story, and every story must begin with a once upon a time of some sort. And once upon a time, 50 miles to the west of Glasgow, in Scotland, in a forest called Kilmagew, there was a castle. This castle was built in the 19th century by the Burns family, who were in shipping coal, like over the 19th century. And like every wealthy person, they built themselves a fabulous castle. You might recognise very similar things, for example, the Viceroy's house in Shilla, or these kind of buildings. But like every rich family, they go under in the end. They all go bust. And eventually, by 1940, they had to sell this building. And they sold this building to the one institute that never, ever goes bust. It's been there since the Roman Empire. It's the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic Church bought this building for a seminary for training priests. And they were very popular time in the 1950s and 1960s to do this. And soon this wasn't big enough, so they built a new building next to the castle in the forest as a place for training priests. And this new building was a high example of modern architecture, got all sorts of awards, and everybody loved it. And they all thought it was a fantastic building, and it was in all the architecture magazines. But they could never find enough priests to fill it, because while this was a new age, in the 1950s and the 60s, it was also the age of the Rolling Stones and rock and roll, and actually priesthood was not such a tempting option for many people, so this building never filled up. And in 1986, the Catholic Church said, let us lock the building up and walk away, and let's think about what we need to do to this building. let's see if we can find some other use for the building. It was like we were talking about at the beginning, when the original reason for a building disappears, what do we do then? But over 30 years, they never could find a new reason for this building. And gradually, the building started falling to pieces. And when I first came there in 2010, this is what it looked like. It was a ruin. It was an empty, very frightening building. It was also a modern ruin. So this isn't a castle, it's not a temple. It's rather like the industrial heritage we might encounter, where people don't have that kind of romantic affection for industrial or modern heritage. It excites a very different feel. There were all sorts of ideas to do things with it. There was an idea to turn it into a hotel, and that the chapel would become a swimming pool, and the altar would become a massage table, or whatever it might be, but probably in a good way, these things didn't actually happen. So this building sat empty and unused for 30 years, 40 years. But of course an empty building, as you will all know, is never really empty. No empty building is actually left alone. You can't just turn the lock and expect that nobody will climb through a window coming through the roof. Everybody always does. Teenage children love to go into empty buildings and see what's there. And this building became a famous building. People came from all around the world to come and see this ruin. And they started to paint things on it. And sometimes those things, they weren't just stupid graffiti that you might imagine. They were quite sophisticated. Herbert Reed was an art historian, and here's a quotation about the history of modern architecture. There's beautiful stories. Here's a piece of graffiti where the old women of the village next door have decided they're going to go hunting. And they're hunting pigs using foxes. But what they've taken is all the knives and things from their kitchen, and they're going out to kill the animals in the forest. Here's the incredible Hulk painted on this building. And over the years, what this building became was an extraordinary art gallery of all of these things. Now, one might say graffiti is bad. Maybe not always. Actually, this place as a room, as a place which people went to even to get abundant, had a strange beauty of its own. But ruin, the word, is not just a thing. A ruin doesn't sit still in time. If you leave it alone, it will dissolve into the ground. So something needs to happen about this building. Either we need to get rid of it, or we need to reuse it. So I was involved in a project called the Invisible College in 2012, 2013, which was about thinking about new ways of occupying this abandoned building. Very often, as I'm sure you will know, even to visit a historic building or an abandoned building is legally incredibly difficult, particularly in this country where you get many, many different owners of one building who can't get real situation. And this is a kind of classic problem of how we deal with and use these things. And it involves getting permissions and waiting and writing letters and making telephone calls. So what I'm going to give you is some very bad advice. Because what we decided to do was not wait for anything, just do it. There was a forest around this building which had once been a garden. And instead of waiting for permission, we said, well, why don't we start gardening it? So when people came to visit this ruin, we said, well, you can't just go and look at it, you can't just take a selfie and go home. You need to get a spade, and you need to dig and plant some potatoes. Because if you do, people will come back and look after the potatoes because they want to eat them. And more people that come back to the place, the more and more people that use it, the safer the place will become. Because the more people that grow potatoes, the less people there will be selling drugs or setting fire to the building or whatever it might be. So it was actually about using it. And it's not illegal to plant a potato anywhere. So it's not like you have to get permission. Okay? A potato is a potato, it can grow everywhere. So actually, there are things you can do where did we hope this would lead? The idea was to eat there, to bring people to eat. So we went to this ruin and we invited all sorts of people. We invited government ministers and people from the heritage bodies and the people with power. And we said, come to lunch in this place. We will cook you lunch in the church, in the chapel. So rather than saying, now let's wait till we have the perfect project to finish the building, instead we'll say, let's have lunch. We started doing excavations, very simple excavations, where this is the growth of 30 years. It's quite dramatic, actually, interesting, the difference between this, that was 30 years ago, 1960s, and I think encouraging people to start excavating the site. And to make it safe, so we ran tours with people and we said, do you think this place is safe? And they go, no, it's very dangerous. There's glass here. Okay, there's broken glass, there's broken wood. You go, okay, so there's broken glass and there's broken wood. What are you going to do? What are you going to do about the broken glass and the broken wood? Because if it's your building, if it's your heritage, then it's your responsibility. Okay, it's your possibility to look after these things. You don't need to, it's not somebody else's responsibility. There isn't the sweeping man down the road whose job it is. It can be your job. You can look after your own heritage. Now, I won't pretend to you that that solves the problem. This is the sign that's now on the front of the building. It says, keep out, danger, danger, dangerous building. But now, of course, because people are using it, they're saying, lies! This takes us back to every situation where it's lies, And how often are there the signs that say, don't come in, keep away, it's not your responsibility, and so on. And how true is that? How true is that? And I think this takes us to a central question about heritage. Heritage, we think of the world of the railway heritage, it was built by people like George Turnbull in a different universe, in a different world. Okay, completely different world to the one we live in. But it no longer belongs to that world, because that world doesn't exist anymore. It's like a dream. It's disappeared. So what is it now? Okay, what is it now? And what can you do with that? Now I realise that I'm speaking here from a very particularly British perspective, where the built environment is very, very, very regulated in a very different way to India. And there's also lots of money for heritage things, but it's very bureaucratic and very regulated. And that means that sometimes if you came to Britain, you would think you're walking around a museum. And even I live there, I feel like I'm walking around a museum most of the time. What I love about coming to something like India is the sense that you can't have a museum in India, because actually it's all alive. It's all alive, it's all actually happening. It's not just dead things that we look at in glass cases, pinned to pieces of cardboard like a butterfly in a Victorian museum. It's living. But that means, in a sense, that you must think, why I'm really interested in coming here, and what I hope I can contribute, is helping people to think of ways to make that live, to make it a living heritage, so it's not just monuments which people look at. There's been extraordinary achievements that I've been hearing about here. It's been absolutely inspirational to hear the things that already have happened. And all I hope is that I can help contribute to more happening. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Ed, for a wonderful talk. Now it is time to take up a few questions, so I hope, from the audience. We will now invite at this point ready to take up some questions.
It is very nice to hear from you. You have made a very good study, not only what is Asansol, but how it is all about started and how it is all about and the whole story properly narrated, it happened to be our story. And such a big story, and it is all lost. And we don't have anything about it except a few memoirs, one or two probably, that is not described enough and more for our people. So that means we have to find and see that this memoir again be rewritten for us, and our people may be able to understand how it was really being done by our people in their own hands and work for this beautiful railway, and we don't have anything except say it is done by the British people. But British people, even if they have done, it is with the help of our people who were indigenously lived here, and they supported, they helped, and they are also involved in this work. So how it is possible for us now to rewrite this story for us?
That's an excellent question, and I'll make a couple of observations which I hope might be helpful. There are kind of three thoughts I have on it, and one of them, as you say, is that the irony, because I'm in Scotland, I have more access to the records of the East India Road, or some of them anyway, than there might be available here for some particular records. But those records exclude particular voices. So the thousands of people who worked on them, they don't get to say a word. And I'm not looking at maybe two things to think about there. And one of them, first of all, is the way that silence is speech. So in ancient Rome, they used to have a punishment for bad politicians. And this punishment was called damnatio memoriam. And it meant that if you were an important politician, you would have inscription with your name all over the city of Rome. But if you did a bad thing, what they would do is they would erase your name from the inscription. But they would do it in such a way that you could always see that it had been erased and what had been erased. So it was like, in the same way, I think one of the really interesting things to think about is the silences. So actually, for example, just before the talk here, we went out to the Durand Institute to look at the War Memorial, the War Memorial plaque. And it's so interesting to look at the names that are there and also the names that aren't there. Okay, and who is remembered and who is not remembered. Okay, so to think about that. So I think that might be one thought, is that silence in itself speaks. The second one relates to this idea of the folk tale. Because I think in a really strange way, I mean, historically, a folk tale, a Little Red Riding Hood, it could be any folk tale. What are they? They are the voices of the poor. Folk tales aren't very often about princes and princesses, very much. They are stories told by the poor, about the poor, for the poor, and they are a way of resisting the grand story that's put over the top. And I think one of the really fascinating things that should never be undervalued, particularly in this country, is the oral tradition and the oral history. Now, of course, an oral story, if you meet somebody sitting by the railway and you ask them what do they think this is, we can't verify the historical truth of what they're saying, but we can listen to it. If we ask the person who's selling tea in the railway station, if we ask the person who's cutting the grass or whatever, actually they know all sorts of things, but certainly I don't know. Okay, and they can tell us those things. It is really important to listen to those stories and to think about how those stories have changed. So if you ask somebody a story about the past, always ask them where they found it from. How did they find out that story? Because actually, that sense of a long thing can help us. So the story of the story is really important. And you say, it's finding ways of listening to that and sharing that is tremendously important.
My name is Sananda Roy. I'm a postgraduate in English literature. And I'm also an aspiring novelist. So, sir, I think that one of the ways in which we might attempt to conserve these heritages is simply to represent them more in our literature. So, I think that while writing literature, I have encountered this problem. Now, these sites, these architectural sites, they were not just, they were not just expressions of British aesthetic, sensibilities, but they were also sites of socio-political exclusion, right? So, what is the implication of writing or constructing a tale in this post-colonial, post-modern, ethos? And what are the challenges that we might hope to encounter in that process? Because nowadays, when you are writing a story in English about this place, suppose, let's say, the first thing that comes to my mind might be a horror story. But a horror story written by an Indian author and targeted towards, let's say, a global audience might not have the same effect as a horror story written by, let's say, Shirley Jackson, who is making ripples on Netflix, right? So I'm talking about a tale which, argues for a British aesthetic, let's say architectural aesthetics, but it's aimed towards global consumption. So there are bound to be challenges, right? So how do we go about those challenges? How do we resolve those cultural tensions that are there? Because these are sites not only of aesthetics but also of violence, of horror, and of exclusion, and there is certainly this divide that is there, right? So if you could shed some valuable light on that, how would we do this?
I mean, I think there's a really two factors there. One of them is within literature and the novel in India. You're very much more about me. I find one of the really fascinating paradoxes is I'm always really curious as what's not written in English. So I feel like I've read quite a lot of Indian novels, but they're all written in English. And what I'm always wondering is, who's the great Indian novelist? Who's the great Bengali novelist that I've never read because they've never been translated? And does such a person exist? So when I arrived, I was in Mumbai talking to a friend of mine who's a novelist there. We were talking about this question, and she lives in an almost completely Anglophone world, where I guess there is this world of Indian literature. It starts with a whole number of different writers exploring this country through that language, but that introduces kind of really interesting paradoxes about it. I think the other question, again, is about the great thing about fiction is that you don't have to explain everything. And this comes back to that question about letting the sciences speak. So I find folk tales about buildings, or trying to write the histories of buildings that they were folk tales, was my temptation as an academic is to explain everything, and then to do 15 footnotes, and then, go so-and-so. But actually, as a fiction writer, or as a story writer, you don't. And instead, what you need to do is show rather than tell. And so, for example, there's really interesting examples of literature where the operations inside, for example, the cantonment is written about from the point of view of the people who aren't allowed in, and what they're imagining is happening there, or what they're seeing of people coming and going. So it's a thing which you get at. It's really interesting. One thing that really fascinates me about the silence voices issue is what did this person, think about what was going on here. So if I was a resident of Asansol village in 1885, what did I think was happening here? Or what did it lead to? And how can we excavate that story? Because it's a very curious, it would be a very curious story. One of the really interesting things, we get these strange, moments of revelation. If you see this picture hanging on the walls, there's the big one, but just underneath it, there is an account book for meals in this place. And have you read what's in it? So what's the first thing that's in the menu? Beef.
Yeah.
What? actually, what's in the people who were bringing this here that is serving it. You know, if you think back to, for example, the music in the beginning of the music, this was a problem that was incomprehensible to the British people. They couldn't understand what it was for. You know, and actually, so it's fascinating to turn the point of view round. So you can tell the story of the king and the queen, but you don't need to tell it from the eye of the king and the queen.
The building, it is as it is described, and kitchen demolished behind.
Kitchen,
Yeah, there was a kitchen outside, but the neighbors demolished it about a couple of years ago. But these walls, they bear testimony that the Freemasons meet here. They do the same rituals which used to go around 150 years. What has changed is that menu.
yes.
The menu has changed, and the topic of discussion on our banquet table, that has changed. But basically, we are trying to conserve what it was and how we'd like to keep it. So till after seeing your last presentation, especially this live dangerous building, it has hurt me, you know. It has hit me that this is not a dangerous building. We are trying to keep.
It's a living heritage.
It's still a living heritage. Still a living heritage. We go through ups and downs, but we try to keep it. We try to maintain it. But
Thank you. Mr. Professor from Asansol village is interested in knowing from you about the land acquisition when the land was taken by the railways. Okay, I told you yesterday. Local people were bribed, they were offered certain things, including a temple. Okay, so we are interested in knowing about your take on that land acquisition.
Yes, the land issue is incredibly complex, I guess. So, I mean, from the stories I've heard being here, again, I've heard different stories already. So one of them is, this was jungle, the Raja gives it away, it's easy, there's nobody here. But I suspect that's not quite true. And actually, as you say, the situation is much more complex, and that they're having to buy people off. I think the example I had, which was closer to Kolkata, where when they're trying to lay out the railway, is actually quite frightening when you think about it. So George Turnbull talked about this as a kind of journey. He says, well, I cut down this straight line, I just cut through the houses, I got in trouble, but not that much trouble. Well, it wasn't half so much trouble as the people whose cottage was on the line, because they must have had a very, very different thing. And I think one of the issues there is, I guess, about land title. It comes back to law and how the law is recorded. So, for example, if it's not written in title deed, so if I own a cottage or even a piece of a building, and I own it by oral convention, then actually I have no redress. When the machine turns up, I can say, well, I've lived here for 500 years and nothing's happening. This is happening now in India all the time. I was in Ahmedabad a couple of years ago, where there were two huge improvements being built. One of them was the banks of the river Sabarmati, which used to be mud going down to the river, with villagers, people living on it and market on it, and they were building walls to guide the flow of the river. And what the walls meant is that I'm a villager by the river. I wake up the next morning with a huge concrete wall. I can't get any water. So what do? They give them a house somewhere else. It's also happening in Benares. I've just been there and around the Golden Temple in Benares. They're demolishing the old city. And the owners of the building are getting big compensation. The people who live there are getting small compensation. But where do they go? They moved outside the city.
They are going up. Banaras is going up now. They've got small places. They are building multi-stories.
Yeah.
There are 20 stories, 25 stories. New buildings are coming up.
But people have lived in place for hundreds of years, and family business, yeah. But their family business, which they built up over generations, disappears. And so I think the same issue is happening in the modernisation, whether it's the building of a railway or a motorway or whatever it is actually the same controversy happens all the time. And usually it's the smallest person, the smallest landowner, has the least rights to find back out. The most tragic example I saw of it was in the Vital Square in London, where all they wanted to do, this sounds very innocent, was to pave the square. You think, of course, pave the square, this is very sensible. But in order to do that, there's a market in the square every day. And what they had to do was clear all the people off the market to lay down the slabs for the square. It sounds like an innocent thing. But the people would not move because the pitch, the one piece of land that they were trading from, they had been sitting there, and their father had been sitting there, and so on and so on. And they were terrified if they moved, they would never be allowed to come back. And so this is kind of, these schemes for improvement or modernisation are a very double-edged sword, and I think it was true of railway as well. It was of course, it was amazing things, but it was incredibly disruptive as well. And one of the really extraordinary stories you were telling me was about how just behind the railway was where lots of people were collected to go and work in the West Indies, in Trinidad and Tobago, which I never knew in all the global stories that are coming off the road, going on the railway away. So it's a very, very contemporary issue, this issue of land. I don't know if that answers the question.
Raising labor, right, that go into building buildings, right? Or let's say, of course, taking off from, let's say, the Latvian understanding of their physical infrastructure and symbolic infrastructure, right? How does one recuperate the labor and stories around that labor, right? That actually would build these building spaces. That's one. The second is, right, this is something that you would possibly be aware of, right? So currently, the single biggest electoral issue in India is around the building, right? And that's called the Ayodhya dispute, right? And it's around this one masjid which was demolished in 1992, and it was claimed that there was a Ram temple, that's the birthplace of Ram. Now, so there was a certain kind of attempt now, right, by taking it to the court, and there are three title claimants to that building space at the moment, right? One which incidentally is Ram himself, right? The Hindu Lord Ram himself is one of the title claimants, right? So there is therefore an attempt to commission a story as national history, right? And which is in itself an attempt to legislate all other stories as unmeritable stories. Right? So there is a regime of censorship that comes into existence therefore in shutting out alternative stories. So how does one deal with commissioned stories around building?
The important question, and I think it's one where it's, in a sense, it's got to be where almost all stories are commissioned. So certainly the one I was showing you just there, the tone of the story is not commissioned in the sense of formally commissioned, but it's kind of definitely part of the imperial project. And you're absolutely right, is that you can get retellings of certain places. So the Ayodhya issue is one of them that I can think of. Certainly in the secret parts of buildings, I was thinking of a medieval version of the same story in Europe, where the buildings are converted from churches to mosques and churches to mosques, and then the whole story is re-inscribed. And I think the question then is, how do we resist that? And again, in a weird way, I think the oral tradition, by which I'm going to answer something in a second, is an amazing sample system. A story, a really good story, or a really good set of stories, should be, when you've got a hybrid, you cut off one end and it just breeds more. And in a weird way, in this current age, we have an enormous strength in that, and that's the digital. My Instagram feed could be a more effective site of resistance than my journalism. Particularly in the Arab world, for example, it's been fascinating to watch watch how women, particularly who obviously aren't allowed to speak publicly, have been able to exist and tell other stories and efficient stories through the anonymity of social media, for example, ways of doing it. But the really, really important thing is to keep telling the other stories. And weirdly, I suppose one of these wise sites, maybe like Biology or whatever it might be, are so controversial because very often those stories are enacted as well as told, so it might be through a particular ritual that takes place at a certain time of the year. In Britain, in Northern Ireland, for example, we have this classic problem of marches. So the Protestant community want to march around a certain area of the land to remember their own stories, and Catholics want to do it at the same time. And very often the marches cross, and they're timed, and then you always get some disastrous fight. But I think it's first of all, I think, how can one produce through different media? Remember, literature isn't just what's in the book. Literature exists in so many forms. It can exist in a game, it can exist in a soap opera, it can exist in a film, in a Twitter feed. These are all writing. But oh God, there was another thing that I thought was really good there. I can't remember what it was. Yeah, the other thing, and I think this is really important, is your own work, which is teaching people to read, by which I mean teaching people to read critically. So that they don't just believe what they're told, because somebody in authority has told them it's true. Do not trust your teachers, especially, okay? But it's really important to be critical. Because if you're not, you'll believe everything you see in the headlines. And everything you see in the headlines is literature. It's not God's truth to send it to whoever said it. And so it's extraordinarily important to learn how to read critically. It's something you can also learn how to do with buildings. And look carefully at buildings. It takes a lot of practice. But to see what actually happened in the building. Very often there are signs around a building that all is not what we've been told it is. So that you might encounter a building which they go, it's always been here, it's always been this way. And you look at it and you go, no, I can tell that's not true. There's been a conversion, something's changed, or whatever it might be. So I think kind of two thoughts. One of them is kind of thinking about what is our friend in modern media as kind of forms of resistance fighting back. And secondly, this issue about reading and critically reading. Because I think the third one to say, which is very frightening in all countries, particularly at this time in history, is self-censorship. But the worst censorship is other people, not the government telling you how to do it, it's people being frightened to write what they actually need to write. And I think that is true everywhere in the world in different ways, but I've certainly seen it in particular situations that there's things people don't feel they're allowed to say or think. And I think that's extremely dangerous. So they need to find a way of saying, even if it's secretly, even if it's writing on the wall anonymously in the middle of the night, it needs to be said.
One more question, the final question. My question is the role of museum in heritage and the park around the heritage site. Okay, does it destroy the dream of the architect?
The park.
Yes.
It's a very interesting question, and I live in a city which, if you've seen it, kind of looks beautiful in the photograph, but it's been designated by UNESCO as a heritage site. So it's like a park. There is only one colour you're allowed to paint the frame with them. And if you paint it any other colour, you'll go to court. Okay, that's how strict it is. If you paint your front door, there's 5 colours you can paint it, but if you choose another one, I don't know what Bengali people would do with this, but I look at the colours of their houses and go mad. And I think the museum is a really fascinating phenomenon. And I just want to make a reflection, which is when did the first museum appear in the world? It's kind of about as a phenomenon. The museum is about 50, 200 years old. And the idea is partly part of the kind of imperial project, partly as part of the scientific project. So in Edinburgh, our museum is filled on the one hand with animals all over the empire, and the other statue imaging objects. And what they mean, I think, is a very strange thing. So, for example, why isn't this in a museum? This must be the most ubiquitous object in our modern culture. And this is the second most ubiquitous object in our culture. Okay? Why are they not in a museum? And then, of course, what happens in a museum is this strange thing that, actually, I'll tell you what happens, is the museum will be buying this now. Museums are buying these now. And in 20 years' time, it'll be a museum exhibit. Yeah, it's kind of like a shrine, yeah. So it's a kind of museum is a container for things which have been removed from life. Or kind of, it's like a tomb, it's like Tutankhamun's tomb, something like that. And what I'd like you to imagine is, say, Britain. So 70 years ago, we ran the whole world. Nowadays, we can't even organise the next week. I tell you, I'm from a country, I don't know when I go home, whether it will still exist. Brexit disaster. And one day, we'll run out of money. And we won't be able to afford the museums. And what will we do with all those things then? And what will happen to all those objects? I think what's going to happen is they're not going to come from China and buy it. Very cheap. But so I think it's really fascinating to imagine the museum as something that has an end as well as a beginning. That we think that we put things in a museum to remove them forever, but actually the museum itself only exists in time. And I think this is also true of the historic park. We were talking about this a little bit yesterday, but in a sense, the worst thing that I think you can do to a building is put a fence around it and say, this is history, and it's separate from life. Okay, buildings will survive because people use them, and they love them. And they love them because they use them, and they use them because they love them. And actually, if you separate it as an archaeological monument, it's it. We've all seen the story about Hampy, for example, in the last couple of weeks, where there's always been a discussion about removing the village from Hampy. But actually the most beautiful thing about Hampy is the village in the ruins, where people are living and being as part of the landscape. And I think that's such an important thing. So the isolating thing, it's in the name of preservation, but actually, preservation for what? What's conservation is as dangerous. Brent Koolhaas, the architect, makes the statement. He says, preservation is extending to everything in the world. What's it going to do once everything is preserved? So if everything is preserved, what do we do then? We put something else. So I think the thought experiment that might be interesting is to reverse it. So what happens when all this comes to an end? And I think, interestingly, that's something kind of historically has happened here. Because of the kind of enormous changes post-independence and the change of status of various monuments and buildings, some of that process has actually happened. Things which were monuments were no longer